Thank you so much. Thanks to the Amsterdam Law School for inviting me into this conversation. I feel like I have this developing and ongoing relationship with the Netherlands and with Amsterdam in particular. Push had one of its most amazing screenings in Amsterdam at this beautiful old huge theater. I can't remember the name of it, my apologies, with 1,200 people in attendance. I mean, it was so moving. And of course it was before the pandemic. And it was during that time that I was in Amsterdam that I met with people from Amsterdam really suffering the housing crisis, but also people from Rotterdam traveled to Amsterdam to meet with me. I was the rapporteur at the time, to tell me about some of the stuff that's happening in the Netherlands, the selling off of social housing in particular, that has become of real concern to me. And you may not know this, or you may, but we now have, the Shift has a representative in the Netherlands, in Utrecht, a fellow named Jan de Vries, who is hoping to establish the Shift in the Netherlands in a meaningful way, and to work with local groups to support the activities and actions that are happening there. So now let me start my so-called keynote in a more formal way. So these days, there are two numbers that preoccupy me. And the two numbers are 1.8 billion and 220 trillion. These are the two numbers that define what's happening in the housing real estate sector across the world. 1.8 billion is the number of people living in homelessness or grossly inadequate housing around the world. And this number would balloon if we included all of those people living in unaffordable accommodation across the world, paying more than 30, 40, even 50% of their income on rent. 220 trillion is the US dollar value of residential real estate around the world. The value that's being enjoyed by a handful of institutional investors, adding zeros to their bank accounts or to the bank accounts of already wealthy shareholders. And European capital cities have been the target of this $220 trillion grab. Berlin ranks first with over 40 billion in housing assets in institutional portfolios, followed by London, and then guess, Amsterdam, with about 23.5 billion in these assets. And with your pension fund, I forget the name of it, ABP, being a major player in all of this. And whereas in other parts of the world, it's mostly larger cities where this activity is happening. In the Netherlands, it's in your largest city, Amsterdam, but in your smaller cities as well, a real threat. The impacts of what we call this financialization of housing are very clear. Most commonly discussed in European circles, I think, is the increasing unaffordability of housing, where housing is increasing, sometimes the cost of housing 50% in a 10-year period, in a 5-year period even. Now, Blackstone, which is one of the largest actors and players in all of this, it's the largest private equity firm in the world, with about 50% of their holdings in residential real estate. So a huge proportion of their holdings are residential real estate. They'll say, but we're contributing to solving the housing crisis. They say, We're providing housing, but they're not. First of all, what they're doing is they're buying existing housing. So they're not contributing in any meaningful way. They're not building housing. And secondly, we know what their motivation is: shareholder profit, period. And that conflicts with affordability, because a good return for shareholders requires ever escalating rents. It is rents that help securitize the loans for these financial transactions. It is rents that pay shareholders their dividends. So it's tenants that are, in fact, both suffering the unaffordability and contributing to the wealth of these actors. So as they upend the housing market, they contribute to the violation of the right to housing for many, particularly through creating unaffordable housing and undermining security of tenure, two cornerstones of the right to housing, which is the right to live somewhere in peace, security, and dignity. And obviously, unaffordability challenges security of tenure. And both of those things, if they're jeopardized, mean your right to housing is jeopardized. Their contributions are worse than that. They also contribute to evictions, and evictions that lead to homelessness are also a violation of the right to housing. We've even found during the pandemic that the increased movement of tenants as a result of these big financial actors putting pressure on tenancies and affordability, that increased action of people leaving homes and looking for other homes, has helped to spread COVID in some cities. But their impact gets even worse than that. They have created a business model that many are now replicating in the financial industry, in the financial sector. They make, these big institutional investors, they make acceptable the idea of housing as an instrument of finance, a lucrative extractive industry, as Professor Saskia Sassen says. And worse yet, in my opinion, as a human rights lawyer, is their capture of the state. They wield superpowers with governments. They negotiate preferential tax treatment. They undermine initiatives to better protect tenants. They provide money for political campaigns that will support their financial stakes and claims. Just check on who is advising your government and the European Union on monetary and fiscal policy, especially during this pandemic. You'll find that one of the largest asset management firms, the largest asset management firm that has many real estate holdings in its portfolio, BlackRock, not Blackstone, but BlackRock, has a seat at the table. Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, is good friends with Macron, for example. And we see what's happening in France with the financialization of housing moving forward. We see Paris as one of the most vacated cities in the world, with a huge number of investor-owned apartments that stand empty. All of this, to me, indicates, exposes that the financialization of housing is a human rights issue, because it's jeopardizing the fundamental right to security of the person, to life, to health, and to housing. And that then suggests, if there are human rights outcomes to this financialization of housing, that then suggests to me that it requires a human rights response. It's my contention that the numbers that preoccupy me are as inflated as they are: 1.8 billion, 220 trillion. in large part because governments have failed to take seriously their international human rights obligations related to housing. And by governments, I mean local governments as well as national governments. It's my contention that governments have the primary responsibility to implement the right to housing and related rights. It's my contention that human rights is both a governance framework and an accountability mechanism, and as such is uniquely able to offer governments everything that they need to get this right, because it covers governance and accountability. So you might say, well, okay, that's nice, international human rights. What does it really offer? Is there any meat here? Is there any substance? And my answer to you is this. If governments embraced human rights as they should, it would, in fact, change everything. So let me give you some examples. It changes, human rights changes who you're focused on and how people are perceived. So human rights mandates the focus is on those who are most vulnerable to rights violations. That means governments would have to pivot if they took seriously human rights. They would have to pivot away from currying favor with institutional investors and their shareholders, and they would have to refocus on addressing the needs of groups like people living in homelessness, low-income people, persons with disabilities, refugees and migrants, single parents, and in some circumstances, Indigenous peoples, although not as relevant in all parts of Europe, mostly in the northern countries. So there's a complete refocus on who gets government attention. It changes what governments want to achieve. It requires a sort of monofocus that all housing and related policies would be calibrated to ensure human security, housing affordability, stability for at-risk groups, rather than ensuring profits for corporations or for international investors. It changes how resources are spent and the amount of resources spent. It forces a recalculation of what resources are actually available. It requires us to recognize that at the moment, institutional investors and corporate actors are beneficiaries of the welfare state and shouldn't be. And I say that because these tax giveaways, because they do get preferential tax treatment, these tax giveaways are lost resources for the state. They are providing welfare to institutional investors and corporations. And a human rights approach requires that to be unearthed, examined, exposed, and addressed. Because governments are required under international human rights law to use the maximum of their available resources to implement human rights and the right to housing. It changes who is responsible for what. As I said, human rights is an accountability mechanism, and it's very clear that governments are accountable to people, human beings, vulnerable groups at risk of violations of human rights. It requires governments to ensure that third-party actors, such as institutional investors and corporations, don't get in the way of human rights. It requires governments to intervene and ensure that any third-party actor in the area of housing is abiding by international human rights law. It changes who gets a seat at the table, as I've already referenced. It requires meaningful engagement with people living the housing crisis, rather than this cozy bedfellow relationship with institutional investors and corporations. It changes when things get done. International human rights with respect to housing requires measurable goals and timelines. And it changes what information is shared and what isn't. It requires the establishment of independent and public monitoring and accountability mechanisms. So the governments become accountable to people so that they can show how it is that that tax dollars are being spent, how it is that when they engage a private actor, that actor is actually helping to meet their international human rights obligations rather than undermine them. So people always ask me, well, you put a lot of emphasis on governments. You're saying this is all about governments, but the actors themselves are not governments, it's institutional investors, it's the private sector. What about them? Don't they have human rights obligations? And of course they do. There are the business and human rights principles at the international level. The OECD has taken those and actually had state agreement around those principles. And those principles say that that businesses should do no harm, that they should not be engaged in practices that violate the right to housing. That being said, those principles have rarely been applied in the context of housing and residential real estate in particular, and those particular business actors. Those actors seem to, institutional investors in the area of housing, seem to exist outside, because they're finance, they seem to exist outside the regular businesses that come under the purview of the Business and Human Rights Guidelines and the OECD guidelines. But I do agree that businesses and finance operating in the area of housing have to understand that once they engage the housing sector at all, once they are engaged in finance for residential real estate, they have entered the arena of housing as a human right. That the business of housing is not like just any old business. They have entered the business of human rights, where human rights is the currency, not dollars and profits. And just as they must abide by employment laws and standards, they must abide by the laws and standards that attach to the human right to housing. But unfortunately, at the international and regional level, the legal iterations don't have strong mechanisms attached to them. And so a lot of what I'm seeing is where there is any kind of movement toward trying to regulate corporations, it's all self-monitoring. It's not independent monitoring. There are some exceptions to that, which I can talk about if anyone is interested, but generally you see companies talking about ESG. Blackstone has a big ESG on their website, ESG, page on their website. The S is completely missing from ESG, social. When it's there, it's defined very narrowly, often around race issues, very rarely around issues around affordability of housing or security of tenure, for example, and tenants and the rights of tenants. So the question is, I suppose, maybe it's the elephant in the room. How do we get governments to do what they should be doing, to engage housing as a human right? And how do we get them to engage housing as a human right and then impose that on institutional investors and corporations? And my answer to that is maybe a little obvious. maybe not. I think it's obvious. We're already doing it, and we're seeing some of the most effective things happening in Europe itself, including in the Netherlands. And so, to begin, obviously, local movements are essential. The people who are experiencing the financialization of housing, taking to the streets, protesting outside of buildings, arming themselves with knowledge, making relationships with journalists who are then doing investigative data scraping journalism to find out who owns our cities. You know, all of that is absolutely essential. That's where the energy for change comes from. That's where the knowledge base for change really comes from. And we've seen this across the Netherlands. There have been protests, incredible movements growing. We've seen this in Berlin. We've seen it in Barcelona, and we're seeing it elsewhere in Ireland. The protests, to be the most effective, in my opinion, must be linked to legislative demands for reform and change. And we saw that with Berlin, where they were demanding a referendum. And they got the signatures for a referendum, and then they held the referendum, and then they won the referendum. And that referendum makes it very difficult for the mayor of Berlin now to just ignore the idea of the expropriation of corporate held units, turning them into socialized units. There's no way. The mayor came in saying that she was uninterested in this. She didn't agree with socialization or expropriation. And then the referendum happened. And even she said, how can I ignore this? More than 1 million votes in favor of this in the city of Berlin, one of the most affected cities in Europe by financialization, of course. And my belief is that these claims, these legislative reforms, these ideas from the ground that are percolating up can best be supported by harnessing international human rights law and obligations that all states, and certainly all European states, have undertaken. Because international human rights law and domestic human rights or regional human rights law provides the why. We can't trust governments to do something because it's the right thing to do. You know, I'll give you an example. People often say, oh, if you make the economic argument to governments, they'll be convinced. You know, you don't need all this highfalutin human rights law and obligations. Just make the economic argument. Well, I disagree with that. We see governments are giving money away through preferential tax treatment. They've allowed the finance industry to invade housing, despite the fact that that doesn't create productive money. It's a non-productive activity, investing in housing. It's just acquisitions. They don't create any value for communities. In fact, they suck communities of money, because not only are these big actors not paying taxes, their shareholders who benefit are not local. They're not taking their dividends and then investing it into your community. Those gains are not going back into your local economy. Tenants are becoming poorer because housing is becoming unaffordable. And so the tenants who are local aren't able to put as much money back into your local community. And despite all of that, governments keep doing this and keep allowing this to happen. So economic arguments, which people tend to think are going to be the strongest arguments with government, don't seem to work. I think human rights arguments, where you have legal commitments, governments have ratified international human rights instruments, that's where you're going to find your strength. There has to be a legal imperative. And that legal imperative is international, regional, and domestic human rights commitments. And those commitments have to mean something. Thanks so much for listening, and I'm happy to take questions if we have time at the end. I'm really looking forward to the next speakers. Thanks.